These are some further thoughts on why it's difficult for someone like myself from the West to understand China. It's taken me a huge amount of effort, even as an anthropologist and after many visits to China and Japan, to begin to understand the differences of that great civilization. In the previous set of thoughts, I dealt with religious differences, monotheism against polytheism, individualistic ideas of the person against group-based civilization, and modes of thought, particularly our kind of binary oppositional thinking compared to quantum type thinking in China. Here I want to look at some of the political and legal differences which make it difficult for me anyway to understand it. The first one is that Western civilizations after the fall of the Roman Empire went through half a millennium of what are known as feudal institutions, and this was a way of governing in which you had an increasingly powerful chief or king, ruler, who had conquered perhaps and delegated power down through a set of sub-infeudations, as they were called, whereby they would give some local chief large powers, a manor, some land, some jurisdictional powers, in return for fealty and loyalty and perhaps the provision of some fighting troops or some taxes. And this system went right across Western Europe and was the basis of the system in England to a large extent as well, in a different form. Now that I took for granted was the basis of my civilization, and we have remained in some ways a feudal civilization ever since. China had been a feudal civilization perhaps 2,500 years ago, but when the first Qin Emperor unified China in 221 BC, before Christ, he got rid of feudalism and he started the track of making China into a unified bureaucratic imperial nation, whereby the people who ran the country were not the feudal lords with a lot of autonomous power, but trained bureaucrats. They were mandarins. Increasingly, they went through an educational system which weeded out people, so that by the end of it, the emperor in the capital was surrounded by the most and best educated individuals. So in a unique solution, education rather than fighting power or delegated authority became the basis of Chinese civilization. And this has continued to this day. China is in many ways a vast bureaucracy to this day, and its top leaders are highly trained and highly selected through all sorts of tests which they have to go through before they get to the top. And China is still highly focused on education as the means of reaching the top in any sphere of government or other aspect of life. So you have bureaucratic, centralized imperialism in one part of the world, and you have feudal, delegated systems in others. And that's a vast difference. It's then allied to a vast difference in the legal system. The legal system in the West was derived originally from Roman law, and Roman law persisted in much of Europe in various ways, or was reintroduced in the 14th, 15th century. And in England, the common law system was very, very powerful. So the West was very, not obsessed, but very much based on legal systems. And so law is incredibly important. One of the things that struck me about China until very recently, when they've obviously introduced a lot of Western-type law, was the disinterest in law. There were traditionally no lawyers, no solicitors. There was no detailed way of explaining how to try people in courts. Law was more or less peripheral. It was, on the whole, if you look at the Ming or Qing law codes, incredibly punitive. It was mainly about how various offences should be punished, and also based on social factors. If you killed your father, it was far, far worse, and the punishment was far worse than if you killed your mother, and so on. So law, until very recently, was not a big element. Disputes were settled within villages and by families, and very little went to any kind of court at all. Whereas in the West, law was in many ways the main thread of life, particularly in the Anglosphere, England and America, but also in continental countries. A third feature that is related to this is the concept of the nation, or spreading out into the empire. I was born, or at least brought up, in a nation state in Britain, and certainly from the 19th century much of Europe was carved up into these smallish, by Chinese standards, entities, 20, 30, 40 million people who said we are the, whatever it was, French, Portuguese, British. And so the nation state is ingrained in my way of thinking about politics and everything else. China has never been a nation state and is still not one, although it's moving in that direction, partly because it's such a vast area. England would fit in many times into China, as would France. One Chinese province like Yunnan or Sichuan is about the size of France. And so it is held together not by a feeling of we the Chinese until very recently. If you asked people's identity, they wouldn't say I am Chinese. They would say I am Yunnanese, or I am from this province, or I am from this town. And so it was not part of the great sweep of nation-state building that happened in the 19th century. And that makes a huge difference. And it's in some ways related to the final difference I'll talk about, which is in terms of the concept of what a nation-state or a civilization should be in relation to other such entities. The West in the last 1,000 years has been notable, among other things, for its imperialism, particularly from the 15th, 16th century, with the spread of the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch and then the British overseas, conquering much of the rest of the world and setting up their empires. This was a theme and deeply influenced all aspects of life. So the West is deeply imperial, and it hasn't finished. The American empire, particularly since the Second World War, is not like the others in the sense that it takes large slabs of land, but its imperial and military ventures are just as lethal and consequential as the earlier empires. Now, we tend to think, or I assumed, that China, once it became rich and powerful again, as it is now, would revert to what we had done. In other words, the first thing they'd think about is going and conquering, either literally taking the land or economically and socially expropriating people in various parts of the world. So the West approaches China as if it would behave exactly as it does itself. But the more you look at Chinese history, the more you see that this is not how the Chinese expanded. They expanded very sort of slowly. I mean, there were wars of expansion in various parts of China at various points of time, but they were very different in nature from the West. For example, in the 15th century, in the great voyages from China, which went as far as Africa and Europe, there was no attempt to settle or to take over the lands using superior technology and incorporating them into China. So China does not have an overseas empire. The furthest it went was Japan, and into neighboring countries like Burma and Vietnam and so on. And this was really to maintain what is the essence of Chinese thinking, which is that China is the middle empire, and it's like a galaxy. It's called the Galactic Empire. It is the sun round which the planets, that is Korea, Burma, Vietnam, and so on, they circle round. They are tributary states, they show deference, they are younger brothers, they send their embassies, and they are protected by China. So it is a galactic imperial system, which, once you understand it, is very different from the direct imperial system of Western nation states throughout history. And once you do understand it, this takes away a lot of the anxiety about what China will do in terms of trying to conquer the rest of the world. Just to take a very small example, what the West did was to plant their military and other technologies around the world. So America now has, 2,000 overseas military bases spread all over the world. China has one in Djibouti, and it could obviously have many more, but that's not the way the Chinese think about things. So those are some of the political and legal. If my previous talk or this one interests you and you want to go into the subject, because obviously I've had to deal with it very superficially, my book, Understanding the Chinese, explains why it's very difficult to understand China, and then tries to explain various features of China. Thanks very much.